Hi, I'm Ivelisse Page, and thanks for listening to the Believe Big podcast, the show where we take a deep dive into your healing with health experts, integrative practitioners, biblical faith leaders, and cancer thrivers from around the globe. Welcome to today's episode on the Believe Big podcast. My name is Ivelisse Page, and it's an honor to spend this time with you. Well, today you are in for a treat as we welcome to the podcast Megan Van Zyl, who is the founder and CEO of Cancer Peace University. Megan received an honorary doctorate from United Theological College in Philosophy of Humanities for her significant work with those diagnosed with cancer. She also holds a master's in human development counseling from Vanderbilt University. Megan works with cancer clients, addressing both the emotional and physical roots of their diagnosis. She also created Cancer Peace University, a training program for integrative practitioners to gain an in-depth knowledge of contributing factors to a cancer diagnosis. I am so excited to speak to you today. Welcome to the podcast, Megan.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've really been following your work and have known several people connected to Believe Big, and I know you guys are so supportive of cancer patients, so I'm thankful to be here.
Aw. Well, we always start our episode with our guest's favorite health tip. Do you have one that you're able to share with us today?
Yes, I do. And it's really important for my own journey. I would say when I was around 22 years old, working on a college campus, I was mentoring college students. And when I was on campus, I noticed I had a significant decrease in energy. And I was only 22 and I felt like I was tired all the time. And for me, it was actually purpose. It was really connecting my health to my purpose that made the difference. And when I realized that if I wanted to have a greater impact on the lives of college students and have the energy for it, I was going to have to change my lifestyle. And that's what motivated me to do a 30-day challenge. And I read Jordan Rubin's book and did his 30-day lifestyle change. And it really amped up my energy. And for cancer patients, they tend to have the motivation. A lot of people have a very strong will to live and a lot of things they have not yet accomplished. And that is really the driving force, I think, is zoning in on your purpose.
I love that. Yes. And I also read that book by Jordan Rubin, and it was one of my first health books that I read, 15 years ago. So It's a great book.
Yes. Very inspiring. His before and after picture really inspired me.
Yes. Yes. So one of the things that I love about what you're doing is, there are people in this world who focus on the emotional healing side, and then there's some that work on the physical healing side, and you do both. So I really love that. Every practitioner has their place and their giftedness. And what I love about what you're doing is that you do both. So I would love to start first with the physical side before we push into the emotional healing side. And I know that you teach about the immune system's role in cancer. How do autoimmune diseases, leaky gut, and chronic infections impact a cancer diagnosis and healing?
Yes. So you really can't develop cancer without having a state of anergy, which is the non-reactivity of the immune system. There's always going to be a continuum of how reactive someone's immune system is and how non-reactive it is. But definitely when someone has a progressive late stage cancer diagnosis, their immune system is not appropriately responding to cancer cells. And a big part of the physical side is finding out why the immune system is dormant and non-reactive. And many times there can be an autoimmune condition that's not diagnosed, inflammation, chronic inflammatory responses that are not completing their healing process in the body. And it's unearthing those. So whether it be H. pylori, whether it be a chronic viral infection that hasn't been diagnosed, like hepatitis B or C. Sometimes people also have exposure to pesticides, parasites, chemical exposures that will cause this chronic inflammatory response. And so that is why you hear those amazing stories when someone, for example, gets on fenbendazole and then they have this amazing response. Their cancer finally responds to the protocol. Well, perhaps the parasitic infection is the major reason why the immune system is depleted. And so when you hit the major reason, then you usually see a shift in the immune system's ability to respond.
Very interesting. It is so interesting. I know that also Dr. Otto Warburg's research on mitochondrial dysfunction and cancer is a core part of your curriculum. Can you explain the chicken or the egg debate in the mitochondrial disease and cancer?
Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely with the mitochondria. Most people during a cancer diagnosis will need varied approaches to supporting the mitochondria, and a common path that intersects between all of what we're talking about with autoimmune and the mitochondria is thyroid health. So thyroid hormone is supposed to be the fuel to really feed at the cellular level, to feed to the mitochondria. And what can happen is, for example, if you have a deficiency in iodine and your body doesn't have enough iodine to amp up the thyroid hormones in the body, then you might not have what you need to produce the right thyroid hormones that can get to the cell to feed your mitochondria. The other thing that can happen with thyroid health and mitochondria crossover is that if there's pollutants or toxins encasing around the cell membranes, then the thyroid hormone might not be able to get inside the cell to act on the mitochondria. So one missing link for cancer patients can be how the thyroid interacts with the mitochondria. And others, it's a deficiency in oxygen. So a lack of oxygen will lead to the cancer cells forming and starting to ferment glucose instead of respiring oxygen to produce the ATP energy. And this is what really mitochondria are meant to do, is respire oxygen to produce energy in an efficient manner at the cellular level. And when there's a lack of oxygen and oxygen deficiency, this is when the cells will morph and change into cancer cells. And that's really the work of Dr. Otto Warburg, but then it was continued through Dr. Joanna Budwig, her discovering the healthy fat connection and how the cellular membranes need to be built with those healthy fats to attract the oxygen into the cell. So there's a lot of different avenues of mitochondrial health that need to be explored.
Yeah, so much that has been done and so much that still needs to be done. And you explain that really well. You know, detoxification is a key factor in healing. So what have you found are the biggest detoxification impairments cancer patients face, and how can they support their liver, bile flow, and even MTHFR pathways, those that have that SNP? And again, I will preface this by saying you're not offering any medical advice and they have to speak to their own practitioners, but in general and overall, what would you share are some of the biggest impairments, and how can people support them?
Well, a lot of times I find that my clients with cancer end up being slow methylators or slow detoxifiers and very sensitive. So if I'm putting someone on a protocol and they have cancer, more than likely they're going to have a heightened response to something, a heightened reactivity, whether they're having more Herxheimer reactions or healing, retracing detox symptoms. And then so they're going to be needing more support. And when you think about cancer has so many different root issues that create the perfect storm that allow cancer to develop. And some of those pathways are how the detox is impaired. It just depends what system it's impaired in. So somebody can have impairment in the lymph system, where the lymph is stagnant and not circulating through and able to detox. And so this is where dry brushing and rebounding can make a big difference. Others do need more testing to find out, do you have an MTHFR mutation that is causing you to be a slow methylator? And a lot of people are exposed to synthetic folate. And we have so much synthetic folate in our system and supplements that can cause an issue with the MTHFR process in the body. And so a lot of times people need to have that type of support to methylate appropriately. And there's a lot of great doctors that do that genetic testing to find out, is there an issue with your MTHFR pathway? Others just have major backup in their liver. They may have even in the past had gallstones or different ways that the body's had to adapt. So whenever there's an issue with detox, the body has to adapt to handle the over onslaught of those toxins. And so whether it's storing it in fatty tissue, whether it's creating gallstones, some people even have the perspective that cancer is really a adaptation to adapt to a very toxic environment internally, a very oxygen deprived, toxic environment that is not able to deal with all the toxins. And so cancer is an extension of the immune system and detox system where there's an inability to properly manage all of that. And so there's so many strategies that are so important during cancer, things like coffee enemas, infrared saunas, modified citrus pectin. And so many cancer patients have an overexposure to heavy metals. And then we have this heavy metal issue of how do we safely and effectively chelate out all these heavy metals we've been exposed to. So there's so many different pieces.
Yeah. And we keep discovering every day how much not only heavy metals, but microplastics are in our foods and things that we're eating. And you mentioned modified citrus pectin. Can you briefly explain what that is and why would be an important way to help the body?
Yes. So modified citrus pectin is one of the first protocols I'll recommend, especially if someone is going to do a biopsy or surgery. A lot of people are concerned of seeding. So if you do a biopsy, needle biopsy, or if you do surgery, there's the reality that the microscopic CTCs and cancer stem cells can spill out in the bloodstream, and then it can resettle somewhere else. But the way that modified citrus pectin works is it breaks apart the clumping that can happen with cancer cells with galactin-3. There's an effect of clumping that causes the cancer cells to be very sticky and then more easily able to resettle in a new area. But the modified citrus pectin will break up that clumping. And so it's really important prior to surgery, prior to a biopsy, and then to be on it throughout.
That's awesome. And do you suggest for someone how long post-surgery have you found that to be helpful with the modified citrus pectin?
Yeah. So Dr. John Elliott, the doctor that discovered the modified citrus pectin and the galactin-3, he actually spoke at the Belgensky conference a year and a half ago. And they had initially just suggested a period of months, but now they're saying at least 2 years post-surgery. Because they're seeing that there's a need for a longevity with it. You know, some protocols you may want to be on it longer, but sometimes it's like the dosage. So with modified citrus pectin, you may want to be on 5 grams for a period of time and then dose it down a little bit, but keep it in your system.
I love it. That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
So, Cancer Peace University teaches about the emotional roots of cancer. So important. Can you explain how childhood beliefs and subconscious programming that has happened can influence a cancer risk?
Yes. So there's different angles to look at how the body is interconnected, interwired, and why it's so important to look at psychology, to look at the emotions. Psychoneuroimmunology is the study of how the immune system is responsive to our neurology and our psychology. And one of the studies looked at cancer patients who were better able to psychologically face their disease. And Professor Herbermann actually found that they had a higher level of natural killer cell activity. And those cancer patients that were more depressed or felt helpless, their natural killer cells were more suppressed in the body. Another amazing study looked at the activity of natural killer cells in lieu of stress hormones. And when there's a high amount of stress hormones released in the body, the natural killer cells were found to be glued against the blood vessel lining, and they remain passive instead of active against the cancer. And so when I look at childhood trauma and I look at how it affects the immune system, the biggest thing that I will say is it just simply causes immune system suppression in the same way that a toxin would with an inflammatory response that can suppress an immune system response. So that's the biggest way, but there's also a larger picture of an energetic manner in which it depletes the ability for the body to have a positive energetic flow the flow of electrons. And so you think about a healthy body does not have any blockages to the flow of information, to the flow of your emotions, to the flow of your system, your energetic channels. But what happens with energy blockages is it starts in our core beliefs. It starts in our right brain, and it's mainly unconscious. We're not aware of it. We create our belief system from womb to 7. So you're literally building your belief system when you're in the womb and until 7. And that's very disheartening for some people that have had horrible childhoods. If you've had a horrible childhood, your core belief system is going to be triggered a lot to cause you to perceive the world in a very negative manner. And so what can happen is the person who had childhood trauma and then has trauma as an adult, their perception of a trauma as an adult will be skewed to make it very hard to even move through that trauma. And so then they can get stuck in a grief cycle. A grief situation can become much more complicated for them to process. And sometimes it's easier to explain this in terms of my experience with my clients. So one way I'll explain it, I had a client with stage 4 adenocarcinoma, and he had a really horrible childhood. But what he felt triggered his cancer was his friend committed suicide, and he had been in premarital counseling, helping this friend, and he thought that's why he developed cancer. But when we started to explore deeper, he realized, and he was able to connect a memory from childhood to the situation with his friend that committed suicide. And what he realized, because he felt like it was his fault that his friend committed suicide, but when we explored that guilt, the blame, the shame he felt, he was able to go back to a memory where he felt the same. And his mom was actually blaming him for going through a divorce with his father. And he, all of a sudden, he was like, oh, this is not even about my friend, even though there's a component. But he was not able to resolve the trauma until he went back. And then he was able to forgive his mom. We redesigned that memory. And then he was able to see the situation with his friend in a different light. And it basically unblocked his own energetic channels. And he was able to really move forward in a much more profound healing manner after that.
That's beautiful. You know, you actually encourage people to become their own brain surgeon by reviewing their subconscious mind. What are some practical ways? So we've heard, the head knowledge of all of that, but the scientific knowledge of it. But what are some practical ways to shift those core beliefs to support healing?
Yes, definitely. There's so many great strategies. And this is where the belief of even understanding what is cancer is so important. And this is why I do a lot of education, because if you believe that cancer is a physical disease with no psychological underpinnings, no energetic aspects to it, then you're going to focus on eating the perfect diet, taking 85 supplements. And so often I've had cancer patients come to me and they're working with multiple practitioners. They're on 60 to 80 supplements a day, doing tons of IVs. They're spending a lot of money, which sometimes is necessary alongside of the emotional side, but they are totally focused on the physical side. And I've had clients come to me that are all in on the physical side, and yet they have this looming trauma that they haven't resolved. And unfortunately, the way that we have traditionally approached trauma has not been supportive for people to resolve. So talk therapy is one of the predominant ways that people will utilize psychotherapy and counseling. And the reality, the research does not support that. When trauma occurs, there's several areas of the brain that can actually shut down post-trauma. And one of those areas is the Broca's area of the brain. And that is actually connected to your speech center. And so your speech center will shut down, and it's the same area that shuts down after a stroke that causes it hard for someone to speak. And so when you try to process trauma through talk therapy, you literally have no language for it.
Hmm.
And so it's actually can be even more traumatic to try to process a trauma through traditional talk therapy. And so it's really good that you're bringing up, well, how do we approach it if we know that there's something that is not resolved? And this is some of the things that we do in our work with cancer patients is how do you dig deep enough to really connect the left and the right brain? Because a lot of the work that needs to be done is in the right brain. It's in the subconscious part of your brain. And partly your brain is protecting yourself. When you're a child, you don't have the emotional intelligence or the ability to process things that happen to you. And so it's a protective mechanism to allow you to continue to grow and learn and still have positive attributes of your life. If we were constantly aware of the trauma we've been through and not able to resolve it, we would definitely be impaired in our ability to interact with the world. So it is a protective mechanism. But now when we're adults, most people become emotionally intelligent or versed, and their brain becomes fully formed and developed around 25 years of age. And the job the rest of your life is really to resolve trauma, resolve your childhood, since we don't live in a perfect world. And when we're connecting left brain to right brain, we have to do simple things that are super powerful. We need to do things like free association journaling, where we're dumping all of our thoughts. If you don't think you have an emotional intelligence or an ability to articulate how you feel, free association journaling is the first place to start, because you're dumping your thoughts that are connected to the emotion. For me, when I first started this process in my early 20s, I remember sitting in Starbucks on their beautiful plush couch, purple chairs that they used to have. And I would dump my thoughts, and then it would be like 20 minutes later, I would finally connect to my emotion, and I'd be like, that's how I feel. And then I would just start crying. And that I had to do that for several years because I didn't have a connection between left and right brain. And it was hard for me to verbalize my emotions. That's how I learned my emotional intelligence. So that's step number one.
Okay. So how many steps are there?
That's a good question. Well, it depends. Yeah, I would say it depends on if we're focusing on childhood or adult trauma. I always have people, I think a great next step is write your timeline of trauma. You probably have a timeline of trauma from when you're a child, and you probably have a timeline of trauma as an adult. Start writing it down and start journaling what you went through. And that can even help retell a story from a different light.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I went away on a retreat with soul shepherding, part of my course, probably about 2 weeks ago. And I realized subconsciously that I had abandonment wounds because of my father dying when I was so little, from cancer. And
Wow.
I had done so much emotional work, and I couldn't believe that 41 years later, I was still grieving the loss of my father. And they had us do that exercise, but with a tweak. They had me write a letter to Jesus to say, tell him how you're feeling about not having your dad around. And so I went through and just shared how I miss not being able to hold his hands, or that my kids weren't able to meet him, nor my husband. And,
Wow.
I went through that whole story. And then the really beautiful part was the next step for me was they asked me to pray, and then to picture Jesus responding back to me. What do you think he would be saying in that moment to respond to your letter? And so then I wrote what he said back to me. And it was so healing. It was so amazing. And so I totally see what you're saying about the journaling, and how attaching the right and the left brain can really be that part of healing those emotions that were hurt, when we were younger, and even today. So I love that. And so, speaking of faith, I know one of the things that I love about Cancer Peace University is that you are faith-based, though you help all, regardless of what background they're coming from, similar to Believe Big. But I love that you have that faith in Christ as the foundation of your counseling and of what you offer. Healing, like you said, is not just about the body. It's about our spirit. So how does faith play a role in Cancer Peace University?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the basics is that I'm a Christian, and I fully believe in God and Jesus. But what I would say is I had my own journey to connect with God in a relational way, and didn't really have a spiritual connection until I was 20. And I think because of that, I really love the process of walking cancer patients through a journey of understanding what they believe and why. And so part of what we do and what I feel our role is realizing that cancer is not a death sentence, that we've seen people in stage 4 go through spontaneous remission, and it's been beautiful and amazing. And that's what we believe for everyone. However, we also know that some of the cancer patients we work with do not survive their diagnosis. And because of that, we think it's very important that we help cancer patients grow in their understanding of their beliefs, how they were raised, what they believe, and growing in that, and really asking those deep questions that maybe they haven't had an opportunity to ask. And, I've worked with everyone from my client that was Hindu to my client that was an atheist to Christians, and all of them grow and learn. And one of my favorite things is just when we go through the memory work, we simply invite God in, we invite the spirit realm in, and God is able to meet anyone wherever they're at and show them what they need to hear. And it really doesn't matter what religion you're raised in. We all need to connect with God in an authentic manner. And one of the biggest, I think, transformative books I've read on cancer in terms of looking at the transition from life to death as a developmental stage is Cancer as a Turning Point. So there was a book, Cancer as a Turning Point. And in the book, they really talk about how to approach death as a developmental stage and how to ask questions that someone might be going through if they're facing a near-death situation. And questions like, what do you believe about what happens after you die? What do you believe about God? Who is God to you? And the most beautiful thing that he talked about in that book is the transcendent death. And a transcendent death is when we're able to fully let go of life on earth and fully embrace life after death and connect with that and have peace in death. And I didn't realize it, but my friend that went through her cancer battle, before I started working with cancer patients, when I was a new practitioner working with children with autism, she had this experience that I couldn't articulate. When we were in hospice, I had a friend share her story of going through a divorce and how she was able to resolve and forgive. And because our friend was in and out of a coma and she wasn't very verbal, we didn't get any verbal feedback. But 2 days later, she sits up in her bed and is completely able to speak. She has this like glow on her face, very peaceful, and her voice had changed. Before that, her voice was very rough and kind of like she had like this rough sound to it, and her face was like kind of like hardened. All of a sudden, her face was like soft. It was like bitterness had melted off her face, and she was the sweetest person you'd ever meet. And she was able to talk to her sister, which she didn't have a really good relationship with her sister. She died 3 days later, but then all of a sudden I knew she had a transcendent death. And I thought, how beautiful was that she was able to transition in that way and release everything, all the regret and pain and bitterness from the past, and completely grab a hold of eternity.
Hey, podcast listeners. We hope you're enjoying today's episode with Megan Van Zyl. This spring, Believe Big is working hard to bring hope where it's needed most. And with your help, that hope can bloom. Imagine hearing the words, "Your child has cancer." For Jason and Melissa Jacoby, That devastating reality came when their 2-year-old son, Luca, was diagnosed with leukemia. It's a nightmare no family should face alone. That's where you come in. Thanks to generous supporters like you, Believe Big stands with families like the Jacobys, providing financial assistance, vital resources, and access to life-changing integrative care. This spring, you can make hope bloom. Your donation becomes a lifeline offering relief, healing, and strength to those facing their toughest battle. Give today by texting Believe Big, no spaces, to 53555 on your smartphone. That's Believe Big, BELIEVEBIG, to 53555. Thank you for believing big with us.
Yes. Yeah. And I think for me as a Christian, I think that's one of the greatest hopes, right? That life here on earth, there is life beyond it. And we have the hope that, we're all going to die at some point. We all have an expiration date. God knows the first moment we take our first breath to the last. And we have that hope that no matter what happens, we spend eternity with him. And so what a peace that gives us that we can release all those things that you're talking about and know that we have this great hope of a future where there will be no more pain. There will be no more disease. There will not be any more crying and sadness, and will be an eternal glory. And wow, that is just such a beautiful picture of what's to come. And we have so much to look forward to. And so in closing, I know our time has just quickly come to us, and I really want to address that because I think sometimes that moment of transitioning into that death or facing death brings a lot of fear to cancer patients. And I didn't want to leave this podcast without you addressing that, because I feel that that is one thing that most cancer patients face. More beyond the physical side of cancer is the fear of cancer and the fear of dying. So what's the most powerful mindset shift you've seen in patients who have embraced what you're helping them work through in the sense of fear?
Yeah. So I would say there's several that come to mind, and can I share two? Because I have two stories that I think would help. So the first story is a surprising turn, because I started working with a client that had stage 4 endometrial cancer. And she was that cancer patient that had the perfect diet, was on 60 supplements, worked with 2 integrative clinics, and her cancer was still progressing. And when we started to work together, she told me that her son died of an overdose, and she knew that trauma was not resolved. I mean, that has got to be the hardest trauma to resolve. Her son was in his early 20s, and they knew of his struggles. They were trying to help him, and he died of an overdose. And she really struggled to resolve that. And that was the first thing we started to work on. But I remember at the beginning of our conversation, she said to me, I know that I might die. And do you work with people in hospice care? And I had to encourage her, because I said, I don't think we're there. I can if we get there, but there's still hope. Like, I don't think we haven't exhausted everything. And she needed to know that we hadn't exhausted everything, because if you're doing cancer and you're approaching it from the physical standpoint and you have unresolved trauma, then you're not done with your work with it. And her story was amazing, because she did 4 rounds of palliative chemo. We addressed the trauma. She was finally able to resolve and redesign those memories of her son dying of the overdose. We were able to invite the spirit realm, invite God into the memories. They were able to shift. She did her timeline of trauma from childhood, which was really just 6 very simple memories. But I still remember the day she reached out to me. We just finished her timeline of trauma, and her scan was the same week. The scan came back completely clear, no cancer in her body.
What?
Yes, she had gone through a spontaneous remission, surprised everyone. And her body had responded. And that Japanese research has found that Spontaneous remission from cancer occurs within 24 hours of a profound internal transformation.
Wow.
And that's our work. Our work at Cancer Peace University is help people have that profound internal transformation. Now, for some people, when they go through that profound internal transformation, it is that spontaneous remission comes. For others, the inner transformation is to prepare for that transcendent death, which is what I've seen with other cancer patients. I had a cancer patient, and this is the other story. My client who grew up in India, and she had an ovarian cancer diagnosis that just came back, was very aggressive. And I still remember it was so amazing because I had a dream of doing a call with her and her mom. And I have a handful of times had dreams of clients, but I had such a straight directive of like, do a call with her and her mom. And I still remember the call with her and her mom. I mean, it was so beautiful because they were able to open up and restore their relationship, talk about things that were hard in their relationship, talk about her childhood. And there was such a peace and a resolve in that relationship that I was blown away, just blown away. And that transformation of that relationship and the transformation in my client's heart of just that inner transformation just stayed with me for weeks on end. And then she did pass. She ended up passing. But I knew just in her heart, she had really connected with God in a genuine way through her process of having cancer and then having that reconciliation with her mom. That was a transcendent death to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. And amazing for her mom as well, that was resolved before she passed so that her mom wouldn't be living with any regrets or shame or hurts. Mm-hmm. And so that is a beautiful reconciliation moment for both of them. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for coming on our podcast today. This was really highly informative, and I know it's going to encourage so many people who are listening. And before we jump off, you had a special treat for our listeners about your 90-minute interactive workshop. So can you share just really briefly about that before we log off?
Yes. So when I was thinking about your audience, I was thinking how awesome it would be to do a workshop, because you had asked, how do you do the inner work? And that's the biggest question I get. How do I know I've done enough work internally to have that profound shift? And so our 90-minute workshop is spontaneous remission. It's closer than you think. And I go through all the science behind what is cancer emotionally, how the brain rewires after trauma. And then we do a lot of these interactive exercises on spontaneous remission, emotional roots, trauma, and we end it with redesigning a memory. So you get to experience redesigning a memory. Some people have never done that before, and it's so powerful. And we're going to offer that for your group on May 15th. It'll be an hour and a half, 5 to 6:30 p.m. We're going to offer a special price for your group, and we'd love for you to join live, and there will also be a recording.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much. And we will put the link in our show notes for anyone who's interested in participating. We will put that link and other things that we mentioned today. Thank you so much, Megan, for joining us and for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this interview. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support our podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. Be sure to visit believebig.org to access the show notes and discover our bonus content. Thanks again, and keep believing big.